The British Treasury made its final payment on December 31st, 2006. $83 million transferred to the United States, closing out a debt that began 60 years earlier. 3 generations of British taxpayers had been paying for the privilege of surviving Hitler. But here's what almost nobody understands. This wasn't a loan between allies. It was the final installment on the largest peaceful transfer of wealth in human history. And it happened while Britain was winning the war. Britain entered World War II as the world's largest creditor nation. They owned a quarter of the Earth's surface, controlled global shipping lanes, and managed the reserve currency that powered international trade. 5 years later, they were bankrupt, gold reserves gone. Overseas investments liquidated, military bases leased to America for 99 years. They owed the United States $31 billion, worth roughly $486 billion in modern terms. The empire didn't fall because of military defeat. It was systematically dismantled by the country that claimed to be saving it. What you're about to discover is how Lend-Lease actually worked, what Britain was forced to sell, who profited from the liquidation, and why the United States cut off aid exactly 7 days after Japan surrendered. This is the blueprint for how empires transfer power in the modern era. Debt plus forced liquidation plus extraction during crisis. The same playbook still operates today. You just need to know where to look. December 8th, 1940. Winston Churchill writes to Franklin Roosevelt describing Britain's situation. U-boats are strangling Atlantic convoys. The Luftwaffe is bombing cities nightly. Equipment needs are desperate. But the real message is buried in the financial details. Britain is finished. They cannot pay cash for American supplies anymore. The empire's wealth is depleted after barely a year of war. This letter isn't a plea for help. It's Churchill negotiating the terms of liquidation. To understand what Britain lost, you need to see what they had before the war started. The British Empire covered 35.5 million square kilometres, roughly 24% of global landmass. Overseas investments totaled $22 billion, equivalent to around $450 billion today. London was the centre of global finance. The pound sterling was the world's reserve currency. Gold reserves stood at $6 billion, second only to the United States. 7 months into the war, it was gone. The mechanism that drained Britain was American neutrality law. The Neutrality Acts kept the United States officially out of the conflict, but allowed sales under one condition: cash and carry. Britain had to pay upfront in dollars or gold and transport everything themselves. No loans, no credit, no exceptions. Since American industry was the only source capable of supplying Britain's needs at scale, they had no choice but to pay, and pay, and pay. In June 1940, Britain launched Operation Fish. They began shipping gold and securities across the Atlantic, moving physical wealth on a scale never seen before. By November 1940, the gold was gone. Britain was still ordering supplies. They had no dollars left. That's when the real negotiation began. The public story of Lend-Lease is Roosevelt's garden hose analogy. If your neighbour's house is on fire, you lend them your hose. They return it when the fire is out. Simple, friendly, cooperative. That story is fiction. The real architect of Lend-Lease terms was Henry Morgenthau Jr., Roosevelt's Treasury Secretary. His priority wasn't helping Britain. It was stripping assets first, providing aid second. Morgenthau demanded a complete audit of British assets worldwide. Everything Britain owned, everywhere on Earth, had to be disclosed and valued. The British objected. Forcing wartime liquidation meant fire sale pricing. They would lose not just immediate value, but future income streams after the war ended. Morgenthau's position was clear: liquidate first, then we'll talk about aid. The proof offering was American Viscose, a rayon company owned by the British firm Courtaulds. It was one of the largest British-held assets on American soil. Morgenthau issued an ultimatum: sell it, or Lend-Lease won't pass political scrutiny in Congress. Britain seized the company under emergency war powers and sold it under duress. The sale price was far below the company's actual value. Proceeds went directly to the United States Treasury. This wasn't Allied support. This was foreclosure. The liquidation expanded rapidly through 1941. British held American securities, stocks across multiple industries, assets of every kind. The scale was staggering. Over $650 million in securities liquidated. Total forced sales exceeded $1.1 billion by mid-1941, roughly $22 billion in modern value. The Treasury Department monitored and verified every transaction before aid flowed. Britain had to prove they were broke before America would help them stay alive. While financial assets were being stripped, strategic concessions were extracted simultaneously. The Destroyers for Bases deal in 1940 is taught as a clever exchange. Britain needed destroyers to protect Atlantic convoys. America gave them 50 old World War I destroyers, most barely functional. In return, Britain granted 99-year leases on bases across the Atlantic and Caribbean: Bermuda, Newfoundland, Jamaica, the Bahamas. Britain traded hemispheric strategic access for immediate survival needs. They pawned the estate for groceries. Lend-Lease officially began on March 11, 1941. Roosevelt branded it the arsenal of democracy. Aid totals were enormous: $7 billion initially, eventually reaching $50 billion for all allies. Britain received $31 billion. But Lend-Lease was never a gift. The name itself makes that clear. It was structured as a lease, and the terms included a clause that would dismantle the British Empire more effectively than any military conquest. Article 7. Article 7 required the elimination of discriminatory treatment in international commerce. That sounds reasonable until you understand what it actually meant. Imperial preference. The British Empire operated behind a tariff wall that gave preferential treatment to goods produced within the empire. This system kept empire markets captive to British manufacturers and locked out American competition. Article 7 was code for opening those markets. Britain signed because they were facing existential destruction. But they knew what they were agreeing to. The economic architecture of the empire had just received its death warrant. While Britain fought, the American economy exploded. GDP expanded 75% during the war years. Britain converted every factory to war production, abandoned export markets, and surrendered their global commercial presence. American firms filled the vacuum. By 1944, the gravitational center of global finance had shifted permanently toward the United States. The reserve currency transition was already underway. Britain was still fighting, still bleeding, still dependent on American supply. And the bill was coming due faster than anyone in London understood. What happened next revealed the true nature of the arrangement. 7 days after Japan surrendered, everything changed. And Britain discovered that survival had been negotiated at a price far higher than victory itself. On August 21, 1945, 7 days after Japan surrendered, President Harry Truman signed executive order cancelling all Lend-Lease shipments immediately. Ships already at sea carrying supplies to Britain were ordered to turn around mid-Atlantic. Factories fulfilling British orders stopped production overnight. The aid flow Britain had become structurally dependent on vanished in 48 hours. The British government was blindsided. They'd assumed Lend-Lease would continue through Reconstruction. Their entire economy had been restructured around American supply. Factories converted to munitions couldn't produce consumer goods. Agricultural capacity had declined. Merchant fleet losses meant they couldn't import without dollars. Suddenly, they had no dollars and no supplies. John Maynard Keynes, Britain's greatest economist, sent an urgent memo to the cabinet describing Britain's position as a financial Dunkirk. Without immediate dollar access, Britain faced mass starvation within months. Default on international obligations was certain. The only option was begging Washington for another loan. Keynes travelled to Washington in September 1945, believing he had a moral case. Britain had fought alone for a year, while America stayed neutral. British cities were rubble. British civilians had endured 6 years of total war. Surely America would offer reconstruction aid as a grant, a gift between allies who defeated fascism together. The negotiations revealed how thoroughly the power balance had shifted. Keynes asked for $6 billion as a grant. The American negotiators offered a loan, $3.75 billion at 2% interest, and one non-negotiable condition: sterling convertibility. This term sounds technical. The implications were catastrophic. During the war, Britain had run up massive debts to colonies and allies denominated in pounds. India, Egypt, Argentina, dozens of countries held billions in sterling credits. But those pounds were trapped. Britain maintained exchange controls that prevented converting pounds to dollars. Countries holding sterling could only spend it on British goods within the British economic system. This captive market protected what remained of British industry. Convertibility meant removing those controls. Any country holding pounds could immediately convert them to dollars. Keynes knew what would happen. Every nation holding depreciated wartime sterling would dump it instantly for dollars. The pound would collapse. Britain's remaining gold reserves would evaporate defending the exchange rate. The loan would be burned through in months. He argued this point desperately. The Americans didn't budge. Sterling convertibility was the price. Britain could accept the terms or face immediate economic collapse without any support whatsoever. The British cabinet met in December 1945. They understood the trap. Chancellor Hugh Dalton called the terms financial Dunkirk negotiations. But rejecting the loan meant defaulting on debts, bread rationing within weeks, possible social collapse. They signed on December 6, 1945. Keynes returned to England, exhausted. He'd spent weeks fighting for terms that wouldn't destroy Britain. He'd failed. 4 months later, on Easter Sunday, 1946, he died of a heart attack at age 62. The loan he'd negotiated would define Britain's economic reality for the next 60 years. The loan agreement stipulated convertibility would begin July 15, 1947. British officials spent the intervening months trying to prepare for disaster. It didn't help. The moment convertibility started, holders of sterling executed exactly as Keynes predicted. They converted pounds to dollars immediately. Within 5 weeks, Britain burned through $1 billion defending the exchange rate. On August 20, 1947, barely a month after it began, Britain suspended convertibility. They'd violated the loan terms immediately. But continuing would have meant total gold reserve depletion within days. The 1947 convertibility crisis destroyed Britain's remaining pretense of great power status. That same year, in February, Britain sent a telegram to Washington, admitting they could no longer afford military commitments in Greece and Turkey. America filled the vacuum instantly with the Truman Doctrine, formalizing the US role as guarantor of European security. Britain's strategic withdrawal had begun. In 1949, under overwhelming pressure, Britain devalued the pound from $4.03 to $2.80, a 30% drop. British citizens became 30% poorer relative to the world overnight. The global reserve currency had just admitted it couldn't maintain value, but the loan remained. Britain owed $3.75 billion plus interest. Unlike the lend-lease equipment that could be written off, this was hard debt requiring annual payments. Through the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s, and into the 2000s, Britain made payments. Governments changed, prime ministers came and went, but the loan persisted. On December 31st, 2006, the British Treasury made the final payment. $83 million transferred to the United States and Canada. Closing accounts opened 61 years earlier. 3 generations of British taxpayers had funded the privilege of surviving Hitler. But who actually profited from this arrangement? Follow the money through the 1940s, and the beneficiaries become clear. Henry Morgenthau's Treasury Department orchestrated the asset liquidations, but didn't pocket the proceeds. American investment banks earned fees on every forced sale. J.P. Morgan and Goldman Sachs handled transactions, collecting commissions on billion-dollar liquidations. American buyers acquired British assets at fire sale prices during forced wartime sales, then watched values recover post-war. Instant arbitrage on a national scale. Defense contractors filled lend-lease orders at full price. Boeing, Lockheed, Ford, General Motors manufactured equipment Britain paid for through liquidation, then later through loan repayments. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower would later warn about was being built with British money extracted under crisis conditions, and the United States government accumulated gold. By 1945, America held roughly 60% of the world's monetary gold. The dollar replaced the pound as the global reserve currency, not through superior economic performance alone, but through systematic extraction of Britain's wealth during their moment of maximum vulnerability. Britain wasn't conquered militarily, they were purchased financially, one forced sale at a time. This wasn't an isolated occurrence or a unique wartime arrangement that ended in 1945. This was the blueprint. The American strategy applied to Britain became the template for every subsequent relationship with weakened allies. Look at Germany post-1945. The Marshall Plan is celebrated as generosity, but examine the conditions. American aid required opening markets to US goods, accepting US military bases permanently, and aligning monetary policy with Washington's preferences. West Germany rebuilt, but rebuilt as an economic satellite. US corporations captured market share during Reconstruction. American bases embedded permanently. The Deutsche Mark's value remained subordinate to dollar policy for decades. Japan followed the same pattern with even less subtlety. MacArthur's occupation restructured the entire economy to American specifications. The Zaibatsu conglomerates were broken up, then reformed in configurations compatible with US trade interests. Japan got prosperity and protection. America got permanent military bases, a captive export market, and eventually the world's largest foreign holder of Treasury securities. Tokyo's wealth flows straight into financing American debt. That's not alliance. That's extraction with extra steps. South Korea offers perhaps the clearest modern example. Devastated by war, rebuilt with American capital and protection, now hosting nearly 30,000 US troops permanently. South Korean economic growth is real, but examine who holds leverage. When Seoul attempts independent foreign policy toward North Korea or China, Washington applies immediate pressure through trade threats or security withdrawal warnings. The dependence created during crisis becomes permanent leverage. The pattern repeats with mechanical precision. Crisis creates desperation. Desperation forces concessions. Concessions transfer wealth and sovereignty. Then the relationship is celebrated as partnership, while the imbalance persists indefinitely. Britain's experience wasn't exceptional brutality, it was the proof of concept. The demonstration that you can strip an ally's wealth systematically during crisis, then maintain extraction indefinitely through debt service and strategic dependence, all while calling it friendship. What made Britain different was scale and visibility. The liquidation was too large to hide completely. The empire too vast for its dissolution to go unnoticed. The financial records too detailed to obscure entirely. Future applications would be more subtle, more distributed, harder to trace in a single narrative. But the mechanics remain identical. Consider what Britain actually gave up between 1940 and 1947. Not just gold and securities, though those represented centuries of accumulated wealth. They surrendered the imperial preference system that had funneled global commerce through London. They abandoned strategic bases that controlled Atlantic shipping lanes. They accepted currency convertibility that destroyed sterling's role as a reserve currency. They watched their export markets get captured by American firms, while British industry remained locked in wartime production. Each concession made sense individually under crisis pressure. Collectively, they dismantled the entire structure of British economic power. And that wasn't accidental. That was engineered. Morgenthau's Treasury Department didn't just demand asset sales randomly. They targeted the specific holdings that generated long-term income and strategic leverage. American Viscose wasn't chosen because it was the largest British asset. It was chosen because it demonstrated American willingness to force liquidation of profitable, strategically important holdings. The precedent mattered more than the specific asset. The Destroyers for Bases deal didn't just provide 50 obsolete ships. It transferred control of the Western Hemisphere's maritime approaches to the United States for 99 years. Those bases didn't just support the war effort. They became permanent projection points for American power after Britain withdrew from global commitments. Article 7 didn't just require non-discrimination in commerce. It legally obligated Britain to dismantle the economic architecture that made empire profitable. Without preferential tariffs binding colonies to British goods, the empire became an expensive liability rather than a wealth-generating system. The 1946 loan didn't just provide temporary liquidity. It locked Britain into 60 years of debt service, while the convertibility clause triggered the immediate crisis that destroyed sterling's reserve status. The loan solved nothing strategically. It simply formalized Britain's financial subordination. Every mechanism served dual purposes: immediate crisis relief paired with long-term extraction, emergency support coupled with structural transformation, and Britain accepted because the alternative was immediate collapse. That's the formula. That's how you acquire an empire's wealth without conquest. You wait for crisis, provide relief with conditions, then maintain extraction through the dependencies those conditions create. The documents are public. The numbers are verifiable. The pattern is clear. Modern empire doesn't require invasion. It requires crisis, leverage, and patience. When the next financial emergency hits, when the next ally faces collapse, watch what conditions get attached to the due yuan. Watch which assets get liquidated at fire sale prices. Watch which strategic concessions get extracted under the cover of friendship. Because the playbook that stripped Britain's wealth over 6 years is still operating today. It's just harder to see when it happens gradually, across multiple countries, denominated in mechanisms most people don't understand. But now you know what to look for.